students who have the best outcomes in the admissions process, they don't just have great grades and good test scores, but their applications tell a cohesive story. I guess the first question is, what exactly is an application narrative? And the way that I define it is that, well, look, students who have the best outcomes in the admissions process, they don't just have great grades and great test scores, but their applications tell a cohesive story. And that story is telling admissions, who they are and how they contribute to a college community, either explicitly or implicitly. So this idea of the personalized application narrative is increasingly important in college admissions, especially at top 50 schools, and especially now during COVID-19, where testing is not going to be as much of a factor. So it's really come down to your personal story, your personal character, and kind of like what sensibility you're bringing to campus. But while grades and things like test scores certainly kind of play a part, this is where the essays, the recommendations, and the resume filled with like really meaningful experiences, activities really come to the fore. So, in other words, the application narrative is just really what your application says about you and who you are. And if you think about it from the admissions officer's perspective, they're tasked with working out who somebody is as a person without really knowing them, or in most cases, having met them. So to do this, they're reading a great deal of information about you, and they're trying to piece together to get a sense of who you are as like a fully formed human being. And they do that by pulling together all these different pieces of the application and kind of helping to shape an overarching story. So every element contributes to your story, and all the different pieces want to complement and reinforce one another. Michael, you are a former admissions director, so would love to kind of hear your perspective on this idea of what an application narrative is to you.
Well, I think you did a really good job in terms of putting it together just now. But I think the bottom line really is you're trying to figure out how to get the admissions people to know who you are in the best way possible with the most complete story that you can give them. And what that means is taking all the different elements of the application and having them have kind of a flow, a continuum in terms of how that kind of tells that story. So if there's something that you're passionate about or it's really important to you, you want to make sure that as much as you express it in your application, your college counselor expresses it in their letter, your teacher recommendations support it, your activities support it. And we're going to talk about that. How does this all come together in terms of creating a cohesive story in terms of what we call the application narrative?
So let's get into the elements now of this. And so, these are all components of the narrative that want to be working together to tell a cohesive story. So obviously first is your academics, in and outside of class. So obviously grades, course load, and course selection, as well as reading and intellectual engagement outside of class, whether that means, doing outside reading, with respect to some sort of school activity or just like on your own personally. Right? That's part of the academic piece. Obviously there's also the personal statement and the supplemental essays, and there's an asterisk there because you'll see the top right corner. We're doing a session, our next session in 2 weeks is going to be specifically on the application essays and particular focus on the personal statement and the supplemental essays. But, in these, these are, they take a central role in helping admissions understand what your story is going to be. Also, obviously the Common App. The Common App has got your short responses, it's got your additional information essay, it's got your COVID-19 question as a part of this year's application. These also play into your narrative as well. And you have to ask yourself, how can those additional pieces help to support the wider story that you're trying to tell? And if you go to the Kate's webinar page, we talk about how to navigate the common application. We touch upon these points, and that we did that seminar, I think, on 24th of June. So then we have the teacher recommendations, like Michael was just talking about. Colleges really value teacher recs because they give them a better sense of who the applicant is as a three-dimensional person, how they interact with peers, their attitude, engagement, curiosity, their role within the classroom. And then with the counselor's recommendation, it'll be who that student is in the wider community. And, the question remains, does the story the applicant is telling seem true and authentic to an external observer? These recommendations can really help to answer that question. And in a moment, we'll ask Michael for some of his advice on how to cultivate positive relationships with teachers, throughout high school, as well as the guidance counselor. And then there's also the interviews, which is also the cherry on top. Michael has said in previous seminars that you will probably see the interview take on a much more important role in the application process this year, because it has to, because the other sort of metrics are not going to be there. And then sort of finally, this idea of activities and social impact. And, we're talking about this, activities and social impact, at least to me, that's usually the foundation of your application narrative. And this is a chance to show how your activities are, a way of sort of like, how you embody your story, how you embody your passions and the values that you sort of talk about or proclaim in the rest of your application. How do you choose to spend your time outside of class? How have you demonstrate what you're passionate about? Are you working towards your future goals proactively? Do you care about positively impacting your community? Do your activities align with the other aspects of your application, or are they random? I mean, you want them to form a cohesive and compelling narrative. So, Michael, from your perspective as a former admissions director, I mean, what gaps, what holes have to be filled? What's your perspective on this?
I think what's interesting is, again, you've summarized it really well, but to think about these days and times, and I think that is going to be critical in terms of applications over the next couple of years. The teacher recommendations, for example, I'm encouraging students that I know to make sure they're using a junior teacher to talk about how a student was able to function in the blended learning of the spring. How were they as virtual learners? Because colleges want to know the self-initiative a student may have taken in that particular situation, the leadership they may have shown in terms of those situations, the directions in terms of other research they might have done. So I think teachers that do that and say that well, I think the downside, which is really weird, as you said before, is, you get to know your teachers. A lot of these teachers, really didn't have the same kind of interaction with students in the spring that they did in the fall. So I think that that's a piece of that as well, too. The guidance counselor letter, I think, is something that's really going to be important this year, because the guidance counselor really has to talk about how did the student function with everything that was going on? Just like the students answering a COVID question, the guidance counselor is answering a COVID question. How did their school function? What did their school do? Mm-hmm. And then those kind of, back to the whole narrative, come together in terms of the story of the student and the school. And I think it's totally appropriate. I know there's parents listening today, for parents to be in touch with the guidance counselor, to talk to them about things that they're not sure the guidance counselor knows about that went on during the COVID period and the student was at home.
That's great advice.
To share kinds of insight that the guidance counselor needs to know. You're not telling them how to write the letter, you're just giving them tidbits of that could be included in the letter. And I think this year, they're very, very important. We're going to talk about the essay in a couple of weeks and really focus on that. But there's your story. As I've always said, I always read the essay first because I wanted to get to know the student. And once I read the story, once I read the essay, then I looked, again, back to your concept of the narrative. What else in the application now ties into this story in terms of who the student is?